So, good evening, everybody. It's me again, Paul Woodadge, here for World War II TV for part 2 of our World War II comics extravaganza, with slightly more guests than last time, with one returning person. Unfortunately, Garth Ennis had not done enough to get away with coming back a second time. He has not earned his parole. So, Calum Laird, editor, Commando magazine, done a PhD on comics, joins us. Paul Trimble, Battle comic Facebook groups, comic conventions. Garth Ennis, writer of numerous comic series. Stephen Connor, professor of history, written about comics, and of course Damien Lewis has done other things with me, current military historian and also war journalist. So we've got sort of 5 incredible guests here to talk about World War II comics. So good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So, I mean, I've got some questions I had kind of written out, and we will touch on them, but also very just talk about things as we go. I'm going to start with Damien, really, because when I posted on Twitter, I think about 3 weeks ago now, and I said, I'm going to do a show about World War II comics, and I said which historians out there were influenced by them. I was kind of just bombarded. Peter Caddick Adams, James Holland, everybody came. Yes, I was. And Damien did as well. And the reason I like Damien's response is that there was that quote of yours, Damien, where you said at some point after a history festival that you kind of like to have your books read like comics, that kind of sense of having action on every page and wanting to make it a compelling page-turning story. So what was your influence growing up with comics, Damien? What were the titles you read?
We always had Commando in the house.
Yeah,
that was the one. Piles and piles of them. So I was brought up on that. And, you know, there's an awful lot of snobbery in the literary world. But let me tell you something. Writing the kind of dialogue and action you get in comics is really hard to do. To keep it that short and succinct with such a small word count, it's far easier, in my opinion, to write really long, literary, flowery sentences which go on and on and on and on and on. It's much more difficult to pare it down to the kind of dialogue and action and dialogue and action and dialogue and action you get in great comic books. So it's a real, you know, in my view, it's a real height of literary achievement, and that's probably a controversial thing to say, and there's a lot of people won't like that, but that's what I feel.
Well, that's a really good start. And I mean, it reminds me what Garth said in the first show about it all being character driven and all about if you can convey character set in World War II or another war, you're going somewhere. So because we've had Garth on the previous show, so Stephen, I'll bring you in. You teach history, and also you've written about comics. So where do comics sit? Where do you obviously you agree with Damien, that they are important. So what's your take on where they should be sitting in and how we look at World War II and history generally?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, the most significant thing about comics is as a research topic. I'm also a lover of the medium, but also in terms of how students are able to use it. So pedagogically, I guess. I use graphic novels, I use comics in my teaching. So I want them accessible, but it really, for me, depends on the questions that we're asking. So, for example, if I'm looking for if I'm looking for students to think about how the enemy other was perceived in the 1940s, then we'll look at comic books, we'll look at music, we'll look at film. So comics then are, for me, one of the flagships of popular culture. And as an academic who both researches and teaches, I really think we need to focus on how important popular culture is in terms of transmitting knowledge. Quite frankly, most of my students, the knowledge they have of World War II comes first from popular culture, be it comics, be it film. That's what they know. So for me, accessing that and using it to teach them, but also as an avenue of research is sort of a match made in heaven.
Well, exactly. And we came up in the first show, that idea of it being an open door to learning more. You know, I remember having a conversation with people like James Holland about the number of people who've seen Band of Brothers dwarfs the number of people who read books by people like James Holland and Damien here. And it's just because that's how it doesn't mean it's a different medium. Millions see a TV show, The Liberator, Alex Kershaw's show. So, Paul, you run a very successful Battle Comics page, and you're kind of more of the fan end of it rather than the kind of creator. But what is it about what the comics that they have something unique that perhaps conventional books don't have? What is it that appeals to you?
Well, comics are the perfect combination of words and pictures as a storytelling medium. And when used properly, when a writer and an artist are working well together, the budget is unlimited. You can include absolutely anything in the story. You can take it in any direction. You can convey emotion, you can convey, you can put a point across, you can convey a historical fact, you can put anything across in comics. And I have always supported the fact that comics are as valid an entertainment medium as films, books, TV. They're not just children's materials. You wouldn't go into a bookshop and expect just to only see children's books. You wouldn't go to a cinema and only see one type of film. So comics cover all genres, they cover all age groups, and it's something that more people really need to be aware of.
Yeah, and I think the purpose of these shows is to get across this idea they are not just entertainment, but also you can understand your history from them as well. Not in the same way as it's like you can read Damien's book, for example, about the SAS, and then you can pick up another book that tells you how an SAS Jeep was operated. They're increasingly, but you don't put the knowledge about the Jeep in the book about the SAS because that's a separate thing. It's a technical manual, but you can also have a comic telling the story that also conveys the excitement and the action, and they kind of all work hand in hand. That's how I feel. That it's a symbiotic kind of process. But Calum, you have the experience of 30 years of being an editor of Commando Comics, and it also later in your career you kind of got involved academically, and you're now working with Stephen. So you've both been a creator of comics and an editor of, but also come back and now looked at them. So what's the kind of key thing you've learned now you kind of understood it academically? Where are you at understanding where comics sit?
Well, doing it academically, I realized, as you said to me before we came on air, that I'd actually been doing things right for years, but hadn't realized why I was doing things right. It gave me a sort of an endorsement that that what I'd been doing was correct and what I'd been taught to do was correct, even though there was no theoretical basis behind it. Comics is a very accessible medium. It's much more accessible than text, because so much of the information is actually in the picture. I had the dubious privilege of presenting to a group of philosophers at a conference. I think it was a timetabling mistake, but anyway, and I showed them a comic picture and then told them what they knew about it, and they had no idea they'd taken in so much information just by looking at the pictures. And that's to me, that's the skill and the art of the comic. First of all, the writer, and then the artist who has to realize the ideas and usually add to them, is that there's a deluge of information to the reader. It's almost subliminal that the reader doesn't realize. And it's like you're saying, it then becomes the gateway drug to history, because suddenly you're looking at, oh, there's an MU-109. Oh, I'd quite like to know about that. And it grows up when you become James Holland.
I mean, I was reading, I think it was Rick Atkinson's book about D-Day the other day, and I was looking, also had it open, I was researching the comic show, I had a comic open, a D-Day paratroop one, and I realized what Rick Atkinson explained in a page and a half about there being a dark sky, the flak-filled skies, aircraft moving across, blah, blah, blah. It was dark, there were Germans on the ground. I got that information instantly in one single black and white image. Everything that 2 pages conveyed to me, I got bang straight in.
Yes.
So Garth, that's we'll bring you in. It's your first time to that. That's obviously what you're striving for. And I was really intrigued by what you were saying on the Friday show about where you get your sources for, and you were reading people like Max Hastings and Anthony Beaver and what have you. And Do you envy Damien? Does Damien envy Garth? I mean, you're in these different fields, but I think you kind of both wish you were the other one. I mean, Garth, we discussed it on that last one. You have that freedom of being able to take your audience to Stalingrad 1 week, and then you can do another, and you can move to Spanish Civil War, and then Burma, and then the Yom Kippur War. I mean, I'm glad thank you for coming back, by the way, because, you know, but where this understanding of where comics sit, where do you think there's some prejudice against comics from within the military history world?
I don't know about the military history world in particular, but in general, yes, there is prejudice against comics. And it's worth noting that in comics, we do ourselves few favors in that regard. The medium is dominated, at least in the English-speaking world, by the superhero genre. And that's really just a function of the history of the medium, of what's sold, of what it's been used for. Paul gave the example of walking into a bookstore and seeing only children's books. Well, in a way, that is not unlike what it's like to walk into a comic book store, because you see 90% of the shelf space taken up with this sort of multicolored long underwear, capes and tights business. And that, unfortunately, is how most people judge comics. And sometimes it's hard to blame them for that. Other genres within the medium, like war, tend to get short shrift. That's what we're up against. Because of that, I cannot always blame people, military historians or the general public, for their view of comics. It's something that we constantly struggle against.
But I mean, do you think it's changing? I mean, I very much appreciate how Damien started the show off with that idea that it's an incredibly important genre, and it's hard, you know, and can admitted how hard it is to get right. So Damien, you know, I mean, have you ever written a comic, Damien? Would you ever do that? And if you haven't done it, why wouldn't you do it?
I've never written one, but that's just because it's never really, you know, come up on the radar. Of course, I'd write one. It'd be a privilege to do so, and a real challenge. Let's be frank about it. Going back to what you said, brilliant point. So I was a TV reporter and cameraman for 20 years, right? What you can convey in a clip of film, or a still image, a photograph, or a picture in a comic book, you know, can cover several pages of a book. So it's an incredibly compact, immediate, dense medium. And the other thing about a lot of the, you know, the Commando and other World War II comics, well, war comics just in general, is that if you actually, so I've actually used them to research a true story that I'm writing. Does that make sense? So I'll just give you one. So, you know, that takes the snobbery away. I'll just give you one example if people can see this. So I wrote that book, which is obviously a true story about an SAS operation. In fact, it's the Bruneval raid largely, but there are pictures. There are actually, you know, pictures and text taken from this Victor, which covered that raid, which I used in the book. Yeah, when you actually read the story in Victor of the Bruneval raid, there it is. Look, if people can see that,
yeah.
It's incredibly accurate. You know, doesn't have very many words, because you don't need that many words to convey what's going on, because the pictures do so much. But when you actually digest the pictures and the dialogue and the action, and as somebody said, the characters that were portrayed, it's bang on the nail. So for me, it's a research resource as well. Yeah. And a really fascinating thing is, how did I get that Victor book, right? Because I said I read Commando as a kid. I was doing a festival at Yeovil Literary Festival just a few months back, right? And a guy came up to me at the end and he said, I read your book, Shadow Raiders. He said, I've got for you the Victor that you use the stills from in the book. And he gave it to me. That's how much, you know, these iconic comics mean to people. Yeah. So he'd read those when he was a kid. He kept all his Victors in his attic, read my book and came and gave it to me. Say, you know, I really appreciate the fact that you gave that medium some gravitas. Not that one should have to give it gravitas, but you know what I mean?
No, absolutely. And you know, I mean, I did a Battle of the Atlantic show a few months ago now, and having reread, and I mentioned it in the previous show, HMS Nightshade, which John Wagner wrote that, wasn't it? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I realized if John Wagner had agreed to that, his description of the Battle of Atlantic over those series of comics was equally good as Mark Milner or these other very serious people who studied the battle. You got the whole Battle Atlantic over those pages, from the ice cold temperature of the Murmansk to losing your comrades when your ship suddenly goes down. And there, as Damien said, you've got an image in a comic that completely perfectly conveys the horror of a ship just disappearing under waves and all those souls going down with it. In a page, you'll be going all through description after description. I've really enjoyed, I said it in the first show, the research for this, because it just pushed up again how important these comics are. So, the thing that's interesting from the first show, my takeaway was the fact that we were mentioning people like Max Hastings and Anthony Beaver. I'm going to bring you in, Stephen, this time. We know with military history, there's been these kind of waves of different types of historians. Like in Canada, for example, you had the 60s and the 70s when they were writing very critical books about their own history. And now you've got your Mark Zelke and others and David O'Keefe writing more kind of proud of Canada's efforts. Have comics been through those same, World War II comics been through those same kind of leaping changes of negative? I mean, explain perhaps and has it been different in Canada to the UK as well? But what are the phases in World War II comic book development?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me begin by saying that war comics concurrently are reflecting contemporary values about war. So what the creator's view of war is, what the social environment is around it. As well as being shaped by the historical understanding of the time that they're representing. So in essence, then, the events that are portrayed, the representations of the characters, really don't tell us much about, say, the 1940s, but how the 1940s are perceived in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s.
Yeah.
Now, when we add to that the engagement of careful creators with military history, then what they're doing is weaving in historical interpretation. And to my mind, that's really the critical aspect here. So comics then reflect and reinterpret both academic and popular history. So it's at the same time they're reflecting historiography and they're reflecting popular collective memory at the time in which they're written. And then subsequently, generations that come after that, or readers that come after that, can then go back and say, these themes, this is what World War II meant to someone in 1950. This was meant in 1970s. And when we think about the way in which it's changed, of course it's changed in the 1960s, from the 1960s. For example, if we're just looking at American war comics, for example, bear in mind in World War II, overwhelming numbers of American servicemen read comic books. That was just part of their world. By the 1950s, of course, Korean War is part of that discourse in comic books. Mid-1960s, comics about Vietnam, and they're relatively few and far between, are broadly reflective of the American foreign policy and Washington's view. By the time, when we're talking about World War II comics, by the 1970s, I think there is a difference between British war comics and American war comics. And there's others here who can speak more to the British comic side of it, certainly. But war comics in the United States, and I'm thinking of mainstream war comics here, do reflect that post-1960s Vietnam syndrome kind of a worldview. And we should note that DC stops their production in the late 80s of their long-running titles. They're just not selling. And thankfully, in the last 20 years or so, we have seen a resurgence of those.
I mean, I was, again, in my research, I was looking at some of the Commando issues from the 60s. And to me, they had the same kind of sensibilities of the war films of the 70s. Not like the war films of the 60s. They were kind of more progressive. The 60s, we were still doing very much the Boy's Own, Cold It. I know the Cold It story was in the 50s, but we were still making those kind of, it was all an adventure and it was all doing it for the squadron leader, for the commander. The comics seem to be more gritty, and particularly battle. I mean, we'll bring Paul in a second, but Calum will bring in you as well. Do you think the comics of the 60s in Britain were kind of progressing things faster than the movies? Were they pushing the envelope a bit?
They probably were, because comics tend to be influenced more by comics than anything else. And you had Harvey Kurtzman in the States, particularly with his Stephen, help me out.
Blazing Combat.
That's the very chap, yes.
Yes.
Which superficially appeared to be gung-ho war stories, but in fact, when you read them carefully, you realised that they really weren't at all. So there was that influence, but particularly Commando, which I can talk about, it was all character-driven rather than action-driven. The stories were all about the characters. So in that respect, they probably were pushing the envelope. And then come 1974, when Warlord and Battle appeared, particularly Pat Mills' contribution to Battle, that changed the outlook quite considerably.
So let's bring in Paul to talk about Battle, because that's your thing, and Pat Mills. So what did Battle do to change the playing field, as it were, in the 70s?
Well, comics in the UK at least tended to reflect what was going on socially at the time. Up until the late 50s, comics would have been really referred to as story papers, and they would have been text stories with illustrations. Through the 60s, then the comic strip began to dominate. And by the time you get into the 1970s, you had really the rise of the anti-hero in movies and television shows. You Clint Eastwood, Dirty Harry, and so on. And things took on a harder edge, even in kids' entertainment. The weekly comics sort of continued on in the vein that they had in the 60s to a certain degree, up until Warlord came out, which was really the first all-war comic. It came out in September 1974. Up until that point, comics were a mixture of war stories, sport, adventure, all sorts of different genres. But Warlord really broke the mold, and it was the first UK comic to really be all war stories, with the exception, of course, of the digests. Battle took that one step further. Pat Mills and John Wagner developed up Battle in response to the launch of Warlord, and they were greatly influenced by the films of the time. And this is what the kids wanted to see. We wanted to get to see the Odessa File, and we heard all about Jaws. We heard all about these films, but we weren't old enough to go. So what they very cleverly did was incorporate a lot of that into the field of comics, with Battle being the first of a series of comics that they created. And you had this rise of the anti-heroes. So you had Rat Pack, who were a gang of criminals who had been pardoned to do these missions for the British and different things, and went on into Major Easy and whatnot. And as I say, these characters were phenomenally popular, and they really reflected just the whole, as I say, the anti-hero ethos that was so popular back in the 70s.
And to everybody, is that also possibly because the people writing with the comics were maybe from a slightly different class than the people who are writing the conventional histories? I think of the conventional histories of the 60s and people like Pat Reed and Colditz. I mean, he was posh. It was lots of public school boys, right, from officers' points of view writing. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, Pat Mills, his politics I would think very different to that of the upper class people in the 1960s writing the conventional histories. So did class have an impact in this, in that you get these working class guys who are actually the enlisted men writing comics, illustrating comics, not just the officers who did it? I mean, I'm referring to my own library there. When I look at those classics written, they are mostly written in the 60s and 70s by the officer class. And they're great books, but they are presenting things in very much that kind of better than the working class. So who want to jump in on that one about the class issue?
Well, it's age to a certain degree as well. In the 70s, you know, as you point out, up until then, comics tended to be written by you know, the tweed jacket and leather patch, a lot of men of that era. But it was John Wagner coming in, it was Pat Mills, Steve McManus, you know, Dave Hunt to a degree. And they all, this was a new age, a younger group of creators and editors who wanted to do things differently, who saw what was going on in the world around them and wanted to reflect that rather than the way that comics had been done up until that point.
So I'm going to ask Calum about that, because you were the editor. So who was coming to the Commando in the 60s and 70s and even 80s and beyond? What people were coming forward with comics?
In the beginning, the people who were writing the Commando scripts were not exclusively, but quite largely veterans.
Right.
People who'd served through the war. That gives the stories quite a lot of gravitas, authenticity, and whatnot. And depending on the skill of the author, they could actually, even though they were writing fiction, they could actually pepper it with so much fact that you do actually get a flavour of what it was like at the time. Alan Hebden, who Garth mentioned last time out, his dad was an artillery officer during World War II, and he was a very good writer. I think his son has surpassed it. But so come the 70s, there are fewer and fewer veterans writing, and a new generation's coming up. Now, that new generation has been influenced by the counterculture of the 60s growing up. And then by the mid-70s, it's influenced by punk. These are all out with comics. You know, these are more popular cultural events. And that changed the way they looked at things. I'm pretty sure that Garth would tell you that the influence of those writers informed, if not influenced, his writing style and the way he handles stories now. But it was Pat Mills did make one comment to me about when he was conceiving Charlie's War, which is about the First World War. Yeah. He realized he couldn't make it an events-driven story like and I'll use the word in quotes, proper history would have been. It had to be about the people. And he said, I had to write it like a girl's story. So he wrote it almost as with the sort of structures of a girls' boarding school story. And that lets you see how important characters are to war stories. Now, if you're doing a history book, characters quite often get left behind, particularly the sort of man on the ground. It's the events, it's the topography, it's the equipment, it's the generals. Whereas I think comics are very good at bringing that back down to a level which most people can identify with. And the other thing, you were talking about class, there are two different outlooks. DC Thompson's comics tended to have more working class, tended to have more working class heroes. And IPC, that's Battle and Valiant, tended to have more lower middle class heroes. You're more likely to find an officer hero in an IPC story than in a DC Thompson story. That all changed in the 70s, and it became much of a muchness.
So let's talk about character again. We'll bring Garth in and Damien as well, because there's a particular author in terms of proper history again. I'm not saying that in any slight, but there's a book, in fact, behind me on my shelf there about American Airborne, where great reference books, but I struggle from page to page to remember who the lieutenant is and which one's that again. I have to go back and say, was he the one in charge of D Company? I've lost it now because the characters are not drawn with enough detail for me to be able to follow who they are. And that's, I think, the similarity between someone like Garth's writing and Damien's writing is the fact the characters are drawn beautifully at the beginning, and you get to know who they are. And then when they come back into, so yeah, that's the French guy, that's the tall one, that's the public school, whatever it is, and you kind of follow them in. And so that's the pros are the same. So Garth, what was your response to what Calum said there about your influences in the 70s? Did that all ring true?
Very much so. It was the work that Pat Mills and John Wagner did on Battle, and then followed it with Action in 2000 AD that strongly influenced the development of my own work. And there's no question that when you look at Battle and you look at the strong working class influence that Pat Mills insists on when he's putting the stories together, that does seem to form a kind of a left turn, maybe, for the depiction of characters in comics. I always think of after Pat and John left Battle to go freelance and Dave Hunt took over as editor, a very important strip came along, one called Johnny Red, And that was about a British fighter pilot flying with a Russian squadron on the Eastern Front. And the reason that strip came about was Dave Hunt, the editor, wanted to get across to the audience something of the Soviet experience in World War II. Up till then, it had really just been British with a few American and a couple of German characters. Dave wanted to point out something about the Russian contribution. This was at the height of the Cold War.
Yeah, I was just going to make that point. Yeah.
And perhaps he was thinking that it wouldn't hurt to remind people of the enormous sacrifices that the Russian people made in the defense of their nation and might possibly be willing to make again. We were, after all, at daggers drawn with these people for 40 or 50 years. And so he spoke to Tom Tully, the writer, and Tom apparently simply took 3 or 4 seconds to think about it and said, Johnny Red. He came up with the name first. Then he created the character to go with the name, and then the story to go with the character. And so what you have is a British character in a Russian setting, bearing witness to the defense of Leningrad and Stalingrad, the mass slaughters on the Eastern Front, women being put in the line as soldiers and pilots, unbelievable, unimaginable atrocity. I think what helps is that you have a British character, an outsider looking at these things in horror, because he never quite loses his awe at the sheer scale of the Russian sacrifice. That was something that made a big impression on me at the time as a kid. And it's something that I then carried on into my own work. I've constantly written about the Russian front really for the last 10 or 15 years. And it's something I'm going to continue to do. The scale of it, I think, is simply inescapable. And that's something that goes back to the experience of reading Johnny Red, 1977 onwards.
I mean, I remember reading that. I again, you're completely right. That's right in the middle of the James Bond films when the Russians were just arch villains and were trying to take over the world and dominating, and we were scared of them. So to have a sympathetic view of the Russians would have been very, very different and novel. And I think again, it's coming back to that idea as well of the fact that comics, I know, and I'll ask Damien as well, gave me an access to parts of the World War that I wasn't getting through normal. Because you could just draw Indian troops or Gurkha troops. If you're making a film about that, you've got to think about where you're going to cast Indian troops, how you're going to film it. But as we said on the first show with comics, you can just launch straight into a completely different theater. You can write about Ethiopia and the Abyssinians. You can write about the Finnish War, the Winter War. You haven't got to worry about where you're going to film it, where you're going to stage it. You just get the idea out and you draw it there. So, I mean, I've been talking to Damien over the last couple of weeks about starting his research work for new things, and you've got to get access to archives. And of course, accessing archives in France or Germany is a lot easier than accessing archives in Moscow or even India or somewhere the other side of the world. So comics definitely gave me an understanding of theaters that I wouldn't be getting through my TV screen. So Stephen, I'll bring you in again, and then Damien as well. So the influences of comics, where they came from, is the Canadian or the North American view slightly different? I mean, you mentioned how there's this divergence of comics in Britain and Canada and the US. But did comics tackle subjects and theaters that weren't coming into homes through other media?
Yeah, I like this question about class and about the kinds of stories. I grew up in an industrial town, industrial city, in a working class neighborhood, and the stories that I read reflected my neighbor's stories or my grandfather's stories. I wasn't interested in what General Eisenhower was doing.
So audio is cutting in and out a bit at the moment.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, but it's Paul who keeps disappearing.
Oh.
So, and when with these stories, particularly in the 70s, it was kind of a perfect storm. Movies that I watched on Saturday afternoon were Cross of Iron, combat reruns, Rat Patrol. There was that when I went to the bookstore, I was not reading A.G.P. Taylor. I was reading Leo Kessler. I'm embarrassed perhaps to admit, or Sven Hassel.
Yeah.
It was that time when these were These were comics, movies, TV, books, were all circulating around the same themes. In Canada, I would say that apart from the war years, in which Canada did have an independent comic book industry that dies out in the early 1940s, by the time I'm reading comics, they're mostly American, but being a Canadian meant that we did have access to British comics. Now, we had semi-annual trips back to the old country, as my grandfather said. So I would fill up my suitcase with British war comics. And I was the cock of the walk when I came back home with these books. They were really the ones that people wanted to read. In my neighborhood, comics were collectively owned, and we shared them out. They were considered to be more accurate, and they were more representative, I think, of a Canadian experience. The uniforms looked like the uniforms in the photographs that the families would have. Even the theaters that they were talking about, even though there wasn't that many Canadians in North Africa, it was still part of our worldview. And frankly, as I said, we enjoyed them more. One of the aspects of them that was particularly happy for us was that they were largely self-contained. You could get in any issue, there would be stories that would be multi-issue, but we could get a self-contained story. And when you were counting your pennies, that really mattered. So I guess the long and the short of it is that there was a difference. And I think in the contemporary graphic novel industry in Canada, I'm thinking, for example, of a graphic novel called Two Generals. You do get that, it's a Canadian story. You do get that echo of British war comics.
Yeah, I'm getting bad internet connection at the moment here. What you just said there, Stephen, really fascinated me about the idea of the comics being something you shared. That's something I really want to bring the other people in there, because that's how I remember going to what we call jumble sales in Essex and buying a big bundle of comics for like 5 pence, all dog-eared, and you didn't know where they'd been, but you'd read them and you'd pass them on to someone else. So there was something very accessible about comics. That, we're talking about an era pre-VHS, pre-being able to download what you wanted. I would go to the library and borrow proper books, but comics were there all the time. So is that an important aspect of comics? It's a media that is transferred from person to person. Is that, who wants to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. Sure. Yeah, there's two figures that you get when you're working within comics, as I did. You get the sales, and then you get the readership. And depending on the comic, depending on the publication, the readership will be 3 times, 6 times, 10 times what the sale is, because all materials like that, all periodicals, tend to be passed around. Most comics, war comics, it would be about 6 times. And there was as Paul will probably testify, there was a black market in the playground. I'll swap you 2 victors for a battle, or 17 valiants for a single commando, something like that. Commando also being self-contained and sort of, they were referred to as novels within the business. They had no sale dates on them, so they could stay in the spinners and the newsagents for forever. So, they continued to have currency, and they were used as currency in the playground.
And I remember as a kid also justifying to my parents that if I asked for a Commando comic compared to the Beano, for example, that I would be learning. So I would hold the pages up where they would explain, here's how a Sherman tank works, or here's how a landing craft works. And I don't know whether my parents really believed that, but I certainly thought I was convincing them that there was something slightly more worthy. No, I'm learning, Mum. No, this is about the world. Look, it's about the Battle of Britain there. That's the Hurricane. So I think that can add something to it as well. So Damien, does that ring true with you? As a kid, did you swap comics? Did you borrow them from other people and share them?
Yeah, it's a funny thing, isn't it? For whatever reason, I'll be really interested in what everyone else thinks. We had piles of comics, and my siblings and me all read them and swapped them, and then you'd swap them with your mates. Of course you would. That's how it was. But you didn't tend to do the same thing with books.
No, exactly.
Like, books stick on your shelf, and when you do lend a book to somebody else and you don't get it back, it's really annoying. especially if you can't remember who the person is. So books have this, they've got this different kind of status, and I'm not quite sure why that is. And just the one other thing I wanted to pick up on was your point about character. You know, you said you read a lot of, you know, thick, let's call it dry history.
Yeah.
And there are so, you know, I reckon the reader can probably get their head around six main characters. That's the rule of thumb I work with in one of my books. So you go any more than that above, you know, the key cast that you want your reader to engage with and know who they are when they come back to them. You start going a lot more above that, you're just going to lose people. That's just the way it is. And they will have to flick back through and go to the index. And then you've broken the reading experience. And comics don't have that. Forgive me, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but comics don't have that. There's no risk of that in a comic story because it is this really tightly controlled cast. And that's one of the beauties of them.
So for the academics, so Calum, Stephen, why would we? I completely agree with what Damien said there. I think I'm more protective of my books. Even as a kid, I was more protective. But comics were considered kind of is a communist idea. You know, they were everybody's. Where does that come from? Why would they be considered in a different way? Have you had any thoughts on that, Calum or Stephen?
Well, in my experience, the buy-in was less. So.
Yeah.
And when I was reading a book, and even the pulp books that I loved as a kid, I didn't want the story to end. And with comics, I knew that on a certain day or a certain week, or when I had enough money, there'd be another comic on the shelf. So there was that steady flow of things, and it was also simply give one, get one.
Yeah.
I wasn't in the business of you know, charitably giving away my stuff. I wanted something back, and it could be anything from trading cards to bubblegum to another comic. But this idea, Calum's idea of the currency, that's exactly what it was.
Yeah, Calum,
Well, I was probably slightly peculiar in that I would trade comics, but I wouldn't trade Commando books. But it's long before I was working there. So I still got all the Commando books that I bought as a child. They're in a box down the stairs somewhere, smelling slightly musty. So yeah, it was just a thing you did, you know. Although I would never swap them for American comics because they never struck me. The Silver Surfer and things like that, and I didn't get it at all.
I felt, my thing was that I never liked the size of the American comics as a kid. There was something about that Commando and that was just, whether it's the pocket or they kind of look good on a shelf. There was something just about the shape, primeval, that appealed to me. The American ones are too long. I don't know why that is, but I want to tackle the kind of this idea of, we started at the beginning of the show, this idea of a pretentiousness where people are looking at comics as being something a lesser art form. And I think part of that is based on this idea that as soon as you mention World War II comics, people of our generation, they go Achtung, Donner and Blitzen, all the Eat Lead Fritzy. And there's even books kind of called that, about kind of joking about. I think that's doing more harm than good. We're looking at this kind of cliched idea that it's all just banzai. Is that doing more harm? And I think if we're looking at particularly the work of someone like Garth, and at the other end, Pat Mills doing this really serious stuff, that's doing it a disservice, isn't it? So how can we make World War II comics kind of be perceived in a slightly more I don't know what the word is, respected way? What's the next? How would we do that? Garth, let's bring you in.
It goes back to the notion of character. It goes back to the idea of making the characters believable. To refer to battle and those comics again, these were the first British war comics that saw Germans as the lead characters. Hellman, the Panzer commander, Fighter from the Sky was about a Fallschirmjäger officer, well, disgraced officer. There was Panzer G-Man, about a Panzer Grenadier. And these were, again, Pat and his contemporaries trying to give us a slightly different angle on things, trying to move things beyond the caricature of the evil Nazi officer with the monocle and Achtung, Handy Hoch and all this kind of thing. These are known as the good German stories. I'm not sure who coined that phrase, but the idea is essentially that usually this guy is a regular army officer, not SS, or if not officer, soldier. and he usually fights two battles. He's got whoever the enemy are in front of him, and he's got the SS or the Gestapo or the German totalitarian state behind him. And he, of course, he walks a sort of rather, he manages this rather fine balancing act between the two. The stories go to some lengths to avoid making Western soldiers particularly dangerous enemies. What they try to do is they portray British and American and Canadian troops as generally decent guys who are opponents rather than enemies. The good German strips tend to use the Russians as these German characters' most dangerous, most lethal, most inhuman enemies. You briefly touched on the notion of the Japanese. I can only think of one instance in which there was a strip with Japanese characters as the leads. It was called Samurai. Pat Mills created it for Battle. It lasted only about maybe a dozen issues. Pat said he couldn't really get into the right mindset. He was also up against the notion that, this being the late 70s, a great many kids, of course, had fathers and grandfathers who might well have been through the Japanese prisoner of war camps and were no stranger to the notion of Japanese savagery and inhumanity in World War II. And essentially, there just wasn't a receptive enough audience to break through and get a very humane, a particularly humane portrayal of Japanese soldiers at the time. But I think when you consider the German strips, particularly the really good ones, like the later Hellman issues, as the Russian front starts to collapse and the Russians advance on Berlin, and a very good one I would recommend called The General Dies at Dawn.
Oh yeah, wonderful. Yeah.
Which is Alan Hebden's portrayal of a German general's fortunes from the beginning to the end of the Second World War. It did give you, I think, an interesting window into what the opposition were like and what they were thinking. I do recall, again, Alan Hebden, one of his particular themes was the war between the regular, not war, but the conflict between the regular German army and the SS. He obviously had to simplify it a good deal for the consumption of the readership. You're talking about 10-year-old boys, but he did get across the idea that the Germans were not one-note characters, which by a long and roundabout route, I think brings us back to the point you were hoping to make. You were hoping I could comment on. Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing again. Is the idea of pushing the boundaries, because let's talk about movies for a second. In most war movies of the 50s, 60s, 70s, Germans were just cannon fodder. They were just grey tunics, helmets. There was jackboots. Then you maybe in the 70s with like Cross of Iron, you start getting the idea there's different types of German units. The Eagle Has Landed has the German parachute, but the comics were tackling Alpine Corps and Fallschirmjäger and the penal battalions, and they were tackling a much greater variety of enemy forces than conventional war movies were doing. So again, this idea we started with about World War II comics as being seen as somehow lowbrow and just for kids. I think the opposite. I think films are at the bottom of the list. I think for every good film, every film, like Come and See, or something like that, there are loads and loads of just shitty TV movies that just rehash the same old crap. I think comics definitely come up higher than that, and I think they're on a par with proper military history, in terms of conveying to me as a kid themes and complicated ideas, albeit, as Garth said, in a simplified manner that I wasn't getting on TV. I wasn't getting in even the documentaries we're making. The World at War does cover the Russian front, but much less than it covers the Western experience. It hardly mentions China, for example, does it? I mean, the World at War, great. I'm not knocking Sir Laurence Olivier, by the way. I'm just saying it is very much a Western version of World War II. Comics, to me, are a much broader view of the conflict. So Paul, Garth was mentioning you there, so you've got some ideas about some of these battle strips and things. So they were taking us in some really different directions and some different theaters. So what kind of people are fans of your Facebook page? What kind of, is there a demographic for people who are fans of battle?
No, not really. I mean, obviously, I mean, Battle ceased production in the late '80s, so you do tend to find that it would be ex-readers, generally speaking, or who find the page and who are most interactive on it. But you know, there are younger fans discovering the old Battle comics. The fact that so many of the creators on Battle went on to work on 2000 AD, which is still being published and has a great following. You find that they then get interested. You know, oh, John Wagner wrote this for Battle, or you know, Pat Mills wrote Charlie's War. So there's an interest that it brings new readers in all the time. Rebellion are now also starting to reprint. We've got the Treasury of British Comics line, where they're reprinting the old strips of the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s in lovely new editions with restored artwork. And you know, these are bringing new readers, or lapsed readers, maybe I should say, back into comics as well, that remember these stories. But rather than go onto eBay and try and find, you know, 20 or 30 individual issues to make up a story they remember, they can now get it in a collected edition.
Yeah.
And it makes everything that bit more accessible.
So I'm just going to change the theme slightly. When I was trying to find guests for these shows, and you know, as I said in the first show, I'm a reader of comics. I don't understand the genres and the writers, and that's not what I do. But I did have a couple of people I contacted, and people who I was told about, who said, no, they've moved on from that now. They don't want to talk about that. They see that as part of their career, but they don't want to be seen now as doing war comics. Is that something that you encounter, Garth, Calum? Is there something that maybe people want to move on from war comics, something considered that's more quote unquote worthy? What do you think on that, Calum?
Well, I think Garth and I are both still writing war comics, so we obviously don't want to put it behind us or anything like that. I mean, there's a very famous illustrator who, well, he drew for Commando, and it was never mentioned on his website. All the other American comics he'd drawn for and everything, they were all there, glorious Technicolor, no mention of Commando. Latterly, he mellowed and has conceded that he did, in fact, start his drawing career on Commando. So, yeah, I mean, there is... The thing is, they've got to project the image that will get them most work. The guys like Garth and me and whatnot, we're there to make our living. You know, this isn't vanity projects or anything like that. This is how we bring money into the house. And you have to remember that it's a commercial product. All right, good writers can steer their readers in a direction that suits their mindset, you know, or their worldview. But at the back of it, it all has to be commercial. And jumping to the other side of the desk, as I'm talking as an editor, it's got to suit me, because I'm not going to put in something that I know or I feel is not going to sell, or is going to be such a disaster that I'm not going to get a repeat sale with the next title.
I mean, that idea. I mean, I sense from the first show and this show that Garth, Calum, you're incredibly proud of being what you are. You know, there's no, and why the hell shouldn't you be? I mean, I really appreciate Damien at the beginning of the show with what he said about right. It's all about what we said. Good writing is good writing, and shit writing is shit writing. If you're writing fiction, if you're writing military history or comics, it's as I quote in that first show when Francois Truffaut mentioned, you know, there's no anti-war films or war films, there's only good films and bad films. And that's how I feel when I look at the books. That I've got books that I would never throw out, but they are there purely for reference. I would never pick them up and read them again. Mm-hmm. There are other people who I will just read it for the sake of enjoying the narrative and the beauty of understanding someone's language, like you play a song, a favorite song that is, you've heard it 100 times, but you just enjoy the melody and the lyrics. But I have to say, with my little small collection of comics and my bigger collection of military history, there's a higher percentage of comics I would turn to again than I would the conventional history. I don't know what that's saying, but it's saying that maybe there's a better quality of writer in comics than there is. I mean, Damien, let's bring you. And you're here on a comics show, but you are, in a sense, a serious military historian. You write further. You speak at literary festivals and what have you. Have you ever seen a comics writer been invited to one of those festivals? Do you think they should be?
No, I've not. I've never seen it happen. And of course, I thoroughly believe that the kind of skills I bring to military history, I mean, I write popular military history, and I'm very open about the fact that I try and bring history alive. And I think authors who don't try and bring history alive are doing history a grave disservice, especially as we're living in a world where young people increasingly don't read, and certainly don't read military history. We've got to make it accessible. We've got to bring it alive. And those skills that I use, narrative, character, action, plot, those are exactly the same skills that comic writers use. They're exactly the same skills, actually, that good thriller writers use. Yeah. They're the same skills. And when you talk about the fact that you more often pick up comics from your shelf than you do your military history tomes, it's because they're well written and you enjoy the reading experience. Yeah. Whereas, let's be frank about it, quite a lot of military history, and I get people, messaging me about this all the time, saying, I did buy this book, but I got 30 pages in and I'd lost who all the characters were. There was no plot. It was badly, comics are rigorously commercial, as we've all touched upon, and they have to be page turning, and they have to get the buyer to come back and buy the next edition next week or next month. And when you're working to that rigor, that's extremely demanding, and you've got to be very good to deliver that. Does that make sense?
That does. And that reminds me about, this thing with all this COVID-19 this year, people on Zoom are being judged by their bookshelves, aren't they?
Yeah.
And we all know that there's books people have on their shelves that they want to be seen on their shelves.
Yeah.
They haven't actually bloody picked up and read. And I've got military books that I have bought because I think I should get that one. And I look at it and I go, oh, Jesus Christ, and it sits there. But you're proud to have it because, oh yes, look at that. That's that 800-page book on military intelligence by DW something or other from the so and so, and you're glad you got it, and you will occasionally refer to it for some bit of information you're looking at. And
can I just jump in there? There's one other thing about this whole thing about snobbery, right? Okay, how can I put this politely? There are books written about military history by people who just want to write a military history book. Do you understand?
Yes.
Because they can show their friends, I wrote this book. Do people ever, and you tell me guys, because do people ever write a comic to say to their friends, I wrote this comic? It's not got the same snobbery value. And why is that?
I really like what we just said there about the idea of the audience of comics, the readers being a very hard critic, because if it's your pocket money, if it's kids, you have only got a limited amount of that. And when I was 10, the temptations for me to what to spend my money on, from Murray Mints and Cola Cubes to Beano to pellets for my cap gun and Commando books, if I had to choose really carefully. I know people who buy military histories who literally buy every book I ever mentioned on a show because they've got the disposable cash to just buy it, and whether they read them all, I don't know. But they will definitely, because they just boom, 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 credit card, Amazon, whatever, Waterstones, and 15 books come. So Garth, I mean, as the comic writer here, your audience, as you say, you're making a living. Calum said you're making a living out of this. If you don't sell, you don't kind of put food on the table. So your audience is very, very demanding. So what pressures do you feel under pressure to kind of deliver what they want? Is it sometimes difficult for you to go the direction you want because you've got to go the direction the audience want, or are you powerful enough in a sense about taking them the way you want to go?
When it comes to war comics, I do what I want.
Right.
But I write more than war comics.
Yeah, of course.
I write in a number of genres, and a lot of the books I've done, you mentioned some of them before, like Preacher and The Boys and so on, and The Punisher, although there's a bit of crossover there, just thinking about it. they have much, much bigger audiences than any of the war comics I write. And so what that means is I can rely on them when it comes time to put food on the table. And the war comics, I am then freed up to do exactly what I want and work with exactly the artists I want. So creatively, war comics are where I can really throw everything I've got into the mix. What that means, of course, is that given that they are not huge sellers, you do have to kind of get them in where you can. You have to persuade publishers. You have to make them understand that if they publish your graphic novel about the Tuskegee Airmen, there'll be another project with greater commercial viability along after that, as an example. But on the whole, I'm able to do what I want when I want to. That's a massive advantage. And of course, that didn't happen overnight. It took me a long time to get there. I kind of had to edge my way into war comics. I'd been writing comics for almost 10 years before I managed to start writing the kind of material I really wanted to in the war genre.
Well, we had that with Billy Tucci on the first show, didn't we? When his eyes lit up when he was talking about writing about the heroes of the 101st and World War II and the Vosges Mountains. I know he's got his she and his genre and his samurai female warrior thing, and it's making him money and it's putting food on the table. But I definitely sense when he was talking to me about World War II comics, there was a sense of, I do this for me. This is all about my enjoyment.
Absolutely.
And I do the other stuff because it does pay the bill. I mean, I know that as a tour guide. I know in a normal year, I have to take people to Pointe du Hoc and Saint Marie-Église, and what I'm waiting for is a chance to go inland to Villa-Bocage and Falaise Gap and things like that. But the Pointe du Hoc tours for Mr. and Mrs. Smith from Wyoming put food on the table. That's just how it is. We all have to do that certain amount of stuff that just provides work. So Stephen, you haven't talked for a while there. So in your study of where you're going with comics now, where's the future? Will we ever get back to the day where World War II comics are read in the numbers they were read back in the heyday of the 60s and 70s? And if not, why not?
That's a question about the industry as well. I can tell you two things. First of all, in terms of the acceptance of this form in academia, it's just a matter of time before someone completes a doctorate using a graphic novel in history.
Been done.
It's just a matter of time. It's commonplace in other fields, and I read something like Chester Brown's book on Lou Riel. It's a masterpiece. That could be a PhD dissertation. So I think academia is a little bit more open to this. In terms of, and I want to revisit a little bit with what Garth just said. It reflects larger debates. So, for example, and Garth is being very modest. My students read his story Johann's Tiger, and they read Citadel, and they read Roll Out. And the reason they do that is we look at it first, and then I say afterwards, okay, what larger historiographical debate is at play here? Which is, of course, what Garth's already said, the myth of the unblemished Wehrmacht, and that unleashes an entire a lesson for me, and this is something that I write about myself. So in terms of academics and historians coming at comics, it's a time for interdisciplinarity, and it's time for us to engage with these, because as I led with, popular culture is so much a part of where my students are coming from, and me acknowledging as a historian where I came from, and these stories that are so much a part of who I am. Will comic books ever achieve? I mean, every time I turn on Twitter, it's the industry's dying or the industry's not. I mean, I can't really speak to that. But there is opportunity for cross media, comics, games, film, TV. These are part of that popular cultural matrix that young people operate in now.
I mean, that must be just gratifying to you, Garth, to think that Stephen is using some of your work as a starting point for a serious academic study about the Wehrmacht in World War II. That must give you goosebumps of pleasure. I mean, I'm happy for you. That would. if someone said that something I did on YouTube was being used by someone academic, I'd be really, really thrilled. So that is positive, that, and I can understand it, because Stephen, as you're saying, and Calum, you've got perhaps someone has got some £500 thesis they got a PhD with in 1976, and there's no photos, it's just text with footnotes, a million words long, and someone said we could start with that, or we can start with a comic. I don't care whether you're 10 or 30, the comic is going to be the way I want to start. And then if that leads me onto something else, then albeit, then I can read the paper afterwards. So, that we've been at this in just over an hour now. What things would you like to, as you've got each other here from different disciplines and studied academically and things, what questions have you got for each other, perhaps? Where would you like this conversation to go? Because I think I've kind of done my bit now. I'm reacting to what you're saying. What have you got questions for each other?
Yeah, I've got one.
Sure.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask Garth, you mentioned this strip about the British pilot who fought for the Russians.
Right, yeah.
Is that based on a true story? Is there any truth behind that?
No, not really. How it worked was you had a typical battle character, a working class lad called Johnny Redburn, who was kicked out of the RAF for thumping an officer. He gets a job as a galley hand on a merchant freighter that happens to be a CAM ship, which is Catapult Armed Merchantman. It's one of those one of those ships with the Hurricane fighter stuck on the front that they fired off. On a convoy to Murmansk, the pilot's killed. Johnny takes over the Hurricane. He dogfights with the Germans who are attacking the convoy, flies to Russia, joins the Russian squadron, and spends the rest of the war with and then leading them. So no, it wasn't based on a true story. There was the RAF wing of Hurricanes that went out to Murmansk.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
In 41, just to convert the Russian pilots onto the Hurricane. But then they left the Hurricanes and went home again. There was the Normandy Niemen group, French pilots who flew on the Russian front.
That's
so you
right,
can see it's quite a cosmopolitan place. But the idea of a British pilot flying with or leading a Russian squadron, no, that didn't happen. That's the sort of hard turn into fiction.
Sorry to interrupt. Just that I was, in my research for this, I was reading some negativity about World War II comics, saying they place these fictional characters in real situations. You'd explain how you did that, Garth, in the previous show, about how you had, your swordfish crews. You didn't have them perform the actual heroic deeds. You had them in the same place as the real crews who did do the stuff. So you could have them in the story, but you left the history to those who actually did it. And I was reading this piece saying, comics put fictional. Well, what about Forrest Gump? Forrest Gump, which is a highly regarded Oscar-winning film, had Forrest Gump going through a series of real events, did it? Meeting presidents in the Vietnam War. How come it's okay for it to be for a movie, but it's not okay for a comic? It's either one rule for everybody, or it's not fair, is it? Why that intrigues me. Is this theme of the fact that it's only comics? How can they do this? And yet, putting characters in film into real situations has been a tool used by filmmakers for decades. So I don't understand this snobbery. I've learned a lot doing this show. So. Any other questions? One of you, Calum, have you anything you'd like to ask Stephen? Because you two are working, or Damien, ask anything. I mean, any thoughts?
I'll answer any questions.
Yeah, I was
going to draw a parallel between Johnny Red and Hellman of Hammerforce, in that Johnny Red has the jeopardy of the Germans trying to kill him. He's also trying to keep his head down so the RAF don't find him. And thirdly, he's got this sort of caricatured Russian political class also after him. So he's got triple jeopardy. And I can't think of another war comic story of that genre, of that era, where there was this triple jeopardy. It's a very good story. It's very complicated in that respect. but it has the, and Garth got away from this when he reinvented it. It's got the 3 pages to get the cliffhanger from the previous episode finished, action and adventure to go to progress the story, and then another cliffhanger at the end. And that, because of that breathless pace that a lot of comics in the anthology form have, it does tend to make people think they're superficial. Whereas if you've got 300 pages on the Bocage country or something like that, they think, well, that's done really thoroughly. They don't actually realize that the cumulative effect of 10 episodes of Johnny Red has told you more about fighting on the Russian front and the planes that were used and the people and the political dynamic as viewed from here. It's this subliminal thing that I mentioned before. People don't realize they're taking in information because it's not in big blocks of text.
We seem to have lost Damien temporarily, although he's dropped, he'll maybe come back in. But I think that's an interesting thing we could touch on there, is that your conventional military history tends to always have the big lengthy prologue where it explains the training and the origins of the war. And it kind of sometimes assumes its audience needs to be reminded of the basics. Whereas a comics, I think, they assume you're coming at it with a prior knowledge. You don't need to be told who the baddies are. You don't need to be told these guys to go through, or whatever it is, a 2-month boot camp. It just takes you straight in. And sometimes I buy a book on Normandy because that's where I live, and I thought, oh, it's 400 new pages. And I realized actually 250 of the pages in the 400 pages are just rehashing the same old thing about, so the Operation Overlord was conceived by, so I know that, take me to what you're telling me new. And actually the new content is remarkably little. And again, this idea we had at the beginning of a single frame in a comic can convey a complex tank engagement, such as in Garth's work, Tankies, in a way that you would take 2 chapters in a book, to a conventional book, to tell that same story. So, I can't keep coming back to this idea of HMS Nightshade being an incredibly good version of the Battle of the Atlantic. I mean, it absolutely was.
Yeah, HMS Nightshade is generally considered to be a poor story. It wasn't popular.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's because I'm looking at it from this kind of military.
Garth's got something to say about
I don't know.
There's a little more to it than it being considered a poor story. It lasted a year, which by battle standards is extremely good.
Well, that's a fair point. Yeah.
I think that the essential problem is that comic writers had, up until that point, always considered ship stories as very hard to get right. Battle had a couple. There was Destroyer. There was a thing about a U-boat crew, but they never really lasted. There's maybe something about an impersonal-looking grey slab of iron at sea that somehow takes away from the kind of character-driven stories that we were used to. No, it's said that Nightshade was unpopular, but it lasted 3 or 4 times as long as anything else in the comic that had tackled that subject up till then. One also thinks of the picture libraries. War at Sea, first picture library, was the first series to get cancelled. It hardly lasted any time compared to the others. But Nightshade, I chose it for a reprint in the Battle Classics series that I was working on a few years ago, because I thought it was so important, because I thought you had John Wagner and terrific artwork by Mike Western telling one of the most important stories of the Second World War in the medium in a way that simply hadn't been done up till then. I think it's worth consideration just for the sheer level of quality. If at the time it wasn't top of the readers' polls, you do have to consider that the editorial team figured it was worth hanging on to long enough for John to complete the story. Mm-hmm. So popularity at the time is not always what matters, especially in an anthology title where you can have the more popular strips carry the less popular ones long enough for them to get their point across.
I mean, maybe that's this thing about sometimes great art isn't discovered within its own lifetime. Sometimes, yeah, that Van Gogh supposedly didn't sell a painting during his career. They were reevaluated later on. And the same applies to some of the classic war films, doesn't it? They were flops at the time and looked at favorably within the next generation. But I think we'll kind of bring things to an end. I think I don't know where Damien went. It was an internet connection or something. I don't know, because I was really enjoying Damien's contributions. But my kind of final point is that, have you enjoyed doing this conversation, really? I mean, have you had many opportunities, any of you, to kind of discuss it on a kind of serious level with a kind of a different kind of audience? Is it something new for you?
Not really. This is a reasonably new experience. I've certainly been interviewed about my war comics before, but it's usually as a sort of preamble to the more commercially successful stuff that they want to talk about. So being able to dedicate the time to the subject, this has been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you very much. And Stephen, Calum, Paul, anything that you've come to light during this conversation? Any things that have kind of registered with you, or thoughts that you'd like to develop or think on? Or
yeah, and I sort of take us back to where we began and where comics fit within the broader field. And the criticism of war comics that we've touched on here, of course, is that they're not realistic enough, or they're not connected to quote unquote real history. When in a medium that's really firmly rooted in escapism, and mainstream comics, the superhero comics, it's about escapism, it's about the unreal. So I find that a very interesting dynamic, that we have this one genre in which it's all about realism. In where I attend conferences all over the place, academic conferences, and this is all I talk about right now. So this is wonderful for me, and there is a growing interest in this field, not just among academics, but more broadly. And I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to chat with people in the field.
Well, great, and we're always happy to listen, and it's one of the things I'm trying to do with this World War II TV, is kind of what I call this cross-pollinate and bring people in from different fields, and have I definitely want to do a show. I talked to Paul Trimble this afternoon, and I want to tackle, I know you writ on this, Stephen, in a future show, the idea of racial stereotypes in World War II comics, or rather in media in general. How has that changed in film? How has it changed in comics? I know we have to be very careful how we frame it, but I think that's a discussion that's worth having as well. I definitely like the idea of the fact we've tackled all these different theaters of combat. I think that's something extraordinary that comics did. And to anyone watching, and I know I'm watching the YouTube comments, there are people watching it who have read comics, and there are people who haven't read comics. Garth, it seems you've sold several anthologies of war stories while we've been online, so there's a few pennies coming into your pocket, but that's good. That's good. But yeah, I think we'll bring it to a close. I just want to say thank you very much for joining in. I've really enjoyed talking about this. I think there's something novel about bringing these people in. I really like the way Damien started the show there, because he's the conventional historian, and I just want to say that myself, who reads a lot of books, I think that World War II comics are equally important as a means of understanding World War II as any other mediums we've talked about. And anyone, I will go forward with a renewed respect for what you do. I've found listening to Garth and Calum, particularly about the creation, and Billy and Ferg last time, really, really interesting. And Damien, I know, has as well, about the process the same. It's the process about characters and telling a story. So there we are. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Ironically, I'm actually waiting for 2 copies of more of Garth's books. Amazon told me they're going to be here 10 days ago, and they still haven't turned up yet. So I'll get them in time for Christmas, I get. But I've had to read volume 2 before volume 1. But and again, I'd had some of these comics earlier, and I'd passed them on to other people. That's the thing. I have to re-buy them now, because I did that thing of them being not really owned. They were passed on. So anyway, this has been fantastic, gentlemen. In terms of, for those watching, my next show is on Thursday at midday. I've got Adam Lunny joining me from Australia, talking about 451 Australian Squadron flying their Spits and Hurricanes in Sicily and Italy and beyond. Then on Saturday evening, got the incredible Marty Morgan, historian, talking about the Battle of Grania, which you remember is the one where the 101st got cut off 15 miles and 80 seconds south of Carrington, and they held off the 17th S, except we'll talk about the real story. So I'm looking forward to that one. Lots more things coming up. So Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Callum. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Garth. Thank you, Damien. And this is Paul Woodhead for World War II TV saying thank you very much for watching. I've really enjoyed it. People watching it enjoyed it. So this is the ending of the stream. I'll see you all again soon. Don't forget to check out the Patreon page. And don't forget to go and check out all these guys' work and comics and things, and check out Paul's battle page and check out Stephen's Twitter feed, and we can all meet again on social media. So thank you very much for watching. I'm ending. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody.
Cheers.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys.